Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
Remember, the cancer of corruption grows in darkness, while the light of the truth brings integrity and honest government. That's a quote from this. Remember your mandate. That's nice.
So guys, before we ask the board any questions or comments in response to the request, I did want to set the record straight on one very important matter. The term bribery, characterization of this is bribery is yours and not of this board. We never in any way either stated nor did we infer that bribery was involved in this in this complaint or in our findings. Also, for the record, realize that this board found that there was probable cause. That is, we believed that there was sufficient evidence to bring action against Councilor Neitzer and to hold a hearing before the City Council. It was up to Mr. Neitzer's colleagues on City Council to determine whether or not he was indeed in violation of the City Code of Ethics. But it was the finding of this board that there was probable cause, based on the facts, that yes, he was in violation of the Code of Ethics. You also state that somehow we were not advocating for transparency. I would also point out to you, sir, that in our letter to the City Council, we recommended a review of policies and procedures involving travel paid for by third parties involving members of the City Council. And we very specifically said that there was a need for greater transparency, and we laid out some ideas as to how City Council might want to treat that in the future. So I just wanted to make that very clear that this board in no way ever said that there was either an allegation of bribery, and certainly we found our findings in no way found bribery had occurred or was intended. That is your characterization.
Right. I was at the City Council meeting. I watched them push away the problem. I was here at the Ethics Board meeting, and I watched you look at the problem a little bit. But both organizations could have done quite a bit more. I believe you were free to instigate an investigation. I think that is within your purview and within your charter. So if you thought it was a real problem, you could have required an investigation. The mayor similarly could have ordered his chief of police to conduct an investigation. City Council similarly could have made a resolution to say, hey, we need to investigate this. And then when I called South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigation, they could have returned my phone call. But none of that happened. And all of it should happen. That's why I'm here. I'm saying, there's a problem. You know there's a problem. You even wrote that there's a problem. But nobody's following up and trying to say how big the problem is and where's the disclosure and where's the investigation. And all these different organizations could do that and should do that, so that's why I'm here.
Okay. So let's open the floor to questions and comments from other members of the board.
I was not on the board for the prior proceedings, so I'm looking at the record that exists, and as I read the purpose of this board, it is to give recommendations, and as far as an investigation, it does not appear that there are facts that are really in dispute. They were pretty much agreed as to what happened. And the one finding that struck me that I thought was key was 3A, the last line, which states, the board finds that attendance at such event funded by third parties raises ethical questions regarding the appearance of potential influence. And That is pretty powerful. And I would think that anyone in the future was contemplating that. This should give them pause that the board has stated that in a finding that attendance raises the appearance of potential influence. You did not mention that paragraph, and I thought that's the key to the whole decision. So,
There's a problem. Sure, the paragraph raises a problem. But where is it going? That's the real issue. Where is it going? City council pushed it away, and they could have done better. Here's a question for the council. Does this board have the authority to order investigation?
Let's keep the floor open for questions.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a question, but I think it's important to keep in mind that not all travel paid for by third parties is a problem. That's clear in the ordinance. It's only when it presents the appearance of improper influence. Someone's employer could pay for some travel for them. I'm not sure whether that would be improper or not, but there's a lot of different circumstances. So I think it's important to point out that not all travel paid for by third parties is necessarily improper with the ordinance. So now in this case, we did find probable cause. The comment that is the focus of this request was based on, as I recall, a comment made by the accused in that matter. I don't want to say it was offhand or there wasn't a lot of details. I think we have a responsibility not to order investigations on, shall I say, a whim. Or we need detail. If there's something that is going on in the city government, that by all means we should and have a duty to investigate. That is investigation. But we also can't be doing investigations on what I would deem to be, it was hardly, in my mind, substantiated to the degree that I would order an investigation. So the other factor that I think is important is the council then did, in the end, while we found probable cause, found it not to be a violation. So why would we order an investigation of something that the council has already found to be not a violation? We also found that despite our finding probable cause, we did not recommend any type of sanction. So that reflects probably also on at least the importance of that particular circumstance. And so we have to be cognizant of city resources, and that would play a role in that as well. So, well, I appreciate your presentation here. I am somewhat concerned about ordering an investigation into what I would consider to be something that probably isn't going to result in anything.
Let me read what I wrote earlier. The critical phrases in that paragraph are third-party paid expenses, and the practice appears to be common. It may be that the practice is so common between the mayor and city council that they want no parts of any investigation and want no parts of any transparency. Now, the reason I suppose that is because you wrote the practice appears to be common. Well, if you're busy accepting illegal gifts, why would you want disclosure? And if it's a common practice among city council and the mayor, they're not going to want to disclose that. So that's why we have an ethics board, so that there is an alternative mechanism to provide for disclosure in the investigation. But so far, it kind of looks like this ethics board is working for a city council and looking for an excuse not to provide that disclosure and not to provide an investigation. It looks like you're all in it together, and I hate to say
To the
that.
contrary, Mr. Guzzi.
Well, then where's the investigation?
A complaint was brought to this board. We investigated that complaint. We reached a finding that there was probable cause, which then triggered a hearing before city council. It was up to city council to determine whether there was or was not a violation. We took on the role of quasi-prosecutor in that matter, presented our case, I think it was a four-hour-long hearing. It was heard by the entire council with the exception of Greg Neitzer, of course, who was the accused. As Glenn Severson said, there really was not much dispute over the facts. Therefore, I'm not sure what you would hope could be accomplished with a further investigation when the facts do not appear to be in dispute.
You wrote that the practice appears to be common. In the interest of transparency and accountability, we should determine how common the practice is so that we can have faith in government officials. That's what I'm trying to say.
Sue?
Well, in hindsight, that phrase that you had focused on was perhaps an unfortunate use of words. We had been presented with a couple of examples, including another city official who attended that very same conference that was the subject of his complaint, but was not in any way charged, and that was one of our challenges. How do we respond to a complaint against one city official when it's clear from the documentation provided to us that another city official was there in exactly the same position? We also were given another example of a counselor who had attended another meeting. So you're right, we haven't defined how common is common. We had a couple of other examples. That was part of our rationale, both that we knew it had happened before and to some extent, and we knew that another city official was in fact in this situation in attendance. We did talk about whether we should have an investigation and felt that that would not necessarily provide any solution going forward. We were focusing on going forward, what can we do? And what we decided was to present this to the city council per city ordinance, because that is the mechanism we are provided. And we presented it to them. We had clear recommendations. We had a clear finding that there seemed to be, an issue with this. But, we chose not to go back and do further investigation of past issues. And I think we are more focused on the future.
Well, to my point, that you're right. There were two other incidents that were brought to our attention. One was exactly the circumstance that Mr. Major brought. So one was very similar. And so when we get an answer from the city council that that's not a violation, we fail to understand why we should investigate something that the council had. They ultimately determined what's a violation. We determined probable cause. So if the council does not believe that's a violation, why would we investigate exactly the same or very similar conduct? I don't understand why we do it.
Why you would do that is because you believe in transparency and accountability and honest government. The problem that we have is that there is supposedly a common practice. And if the practice is common, well then the people that are involved will probably want to protect their reputation. And they would look for an excuse not to have an investigation. And they would also look for an excuse to say everything is fine the way it is. Right, I'm focusing on that phrase, common practice, because that's what you wrote, probably after careful consideration. And if we want to have faith in government, we need to disclose common illegal practices. The ordinance is pretty clear. It says you can't accept gifts of third-party paid travel when they look suspicious.
That's not exactly what the ordinance says.
Well, I read it earlier.
What it says, and you quoted it, city officials may not directly or indirectly solicit any gift or accept any gift, whether in the form of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, under circumstances in which it could reasonably be inferred that the gift was intended to influence or could reasonably be expected to influence the officer or was intended as a reward for any official action. I think often we focus on the first half of that sentence, you can't accept gifts, but we miss the rest of the sentence. It doesn't say anything about you can't accept gifts because this is bribery. It doesn't say you can't accept gifts because this looks suspicious. It says under these circumstances you can't accept gifts. And so I think we get a little careless with throwing around the word bribery. I was going to say the same things you did to start your comments, Mr. Chairman, because I had exactly the same thoughts.
Hello. The other thing I wanted to point out to you, Mr. Zakaitis, as well as everybody, as well as the public, were the recommendations that we gave to the city council, which to my knowledge have not been acted upon. At a minimum, the board recommends the city council review and adopt policies that inform officers and officials when and whether attendance is acceptable for seminars, conventions, or other travel that is financed by a third party, and any such proposed travel shall be a matter of public record and be approved by a vote of the city council prior to attendance by officer or official. Those were our recommendations to the city council. We are not a legislative body. It is up to the city council to review their own policies and procedures and to pass legislation. It's not our responsibility. But we certainly advocate for ethical and legal behavior on the part of our elected and officials as well as our employees. And we think we laid out to the city council exactly what they should do when it comes to future travel paid for by a third party.
Since the word bribe or bribery has been the point of dispute for a little while, I happen to find a dictionary online. To bribe is to persuade someone to act in one's favor, typically illegally or dishonestly or by a gift of money or other inducements.
Mr. Zakaitis, we're not here. This is not an allegation of bribery, and there was no finding, but on our part that bribery was involved here. So, are there any further comments or questions from the board? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Zakaitis.
That definition of bribery is remarkably similar to the wording of your city council of the law, the ordinance. It's just a little bit different. So I think you should worry less about the term bribery and worry more about gifts of paid travel that clearly violate city ordinance.
Thank you very much. Is there any further discussion or any action that this board wishes to consider? This matter?
Well, I don't know if we need to act, I would move that we decline the invitation to investigate.
I would second that.
Okay. A motion made by Dan Fritz, seconded by Sue Rouse. Let's open the floor for discussion on that motion.
I don't believe there's enough here to investigate anything that I would deem to be a violation of the other rules.
Why don't we look at that?
We can't hear you. Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I'm just looking over the bylaws here, rules of procedure on input.
Bear with us for a moment, please. discussion on the part of the board? So the motion, do you want to repeat the motion?
My motion would be that this board decline the request for an investigation submitted by Mr. Weeks.
All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Do you have a second?
We did. All opposed, say no. Passes 4-0. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is a presentation requested by Councilor Janet Brecky. Janet, I guess we probably should swear you in. I'm not quite sure how to handle this one, but let's see.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you shall give relative to this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the penalties of perjury? I do.
Councilor Brecky, would you identify yourself, please?
My name is Janet Brecken. I'm a Sioux Falls City Council member, and I am here in my official capacity. I've been here before, given public input as a council member, wearing that hat, but I did have several conversations with the city attorney about how to proceed with legislation affecting an ordinance that you're responsible for. I mean, that this ordinance is your ordinance. You have the right to give advice on how to change the ordinance. It's clear to the council that is one of your responsibilities. Should you decide to, you can actually propose legislation. You can't bring it to the council. You have to use the council as a conduit. So on the reverse side, Stacy and I talked about it, on a couple of occasions. Okay, I want to have a working session with them. I don't want to just be a presenter. I want to roll up my sleeves. If we are going to make some, changes to the ethics ordinance, there needs to be a collaborative effort between the council, and this body. And I think that this body's influence really should be the primary focus, because that is what the whole area of ethics was designed to do, to be peeled off to a board to handle that, and as much as possible, keep the council and the administration out of it, because that's when it becomes political.
So you're prepared to offer a revision to the City Code of Ethics, and you're seeking our input today, or you're
I'm
informing
seeking
us?
input, I'm seeking ideas, suggestions, and I have already presented it to the city council.
So it's at a first reading.
No, it hasn't had a first reading. I presented at an informational meeting, and I asked for input from them. And then I said, after I get input from you guys, I'm going to take it to the Board of Ethics, and then I'll bounce it back to them, probably at another informational, if there's any changes, before I actually go to the first reading.
Mr. Chrysler, is it any guidance on this?
No, she's correct. We've consulted on it and discussed it, and that's why it's put on the agenda as a review. Basically, she's seeking input. This is a format for doing it, so we're contemplating on the agenda. And so the ethics board is free to engage in a discussion with Councilor Brecky. Here's questions.
So my first question was, you have a copy of the ordinance, because it's in the packet, right? And then I gave a copy of this information that I obtained from the internet.
Bonnie, is that available to the public? The
I
copy?
did this at an earlier thing too. I don't think,
No, I'm
Judge Severson was on
the packet that's out for the public. They have the copy of the proposed ordinance.
I didn't have any information as to, other than the ordinance was the only thing that I was given.
Right, but is the ordinance, has it been distributed to the public?
Yes, that was
It's
in the one
packet.
Yeah, fine,
Sorry.
fine.
I thought you meant what she was.
No, just
saying.
I just want to be sure that others who are here can follow along. Okay.
I've only got 3 of these, but I know Judge Severson has received one, but I think all of the rest of it was in a previous presentation that I made during public input, and where I told you that I was going to just review the ordinance. And this was, really quite some time ago, where I said I think it was important to review the ordinance. It was written, I believe, in 1995, and I just wanted to, I had gone out on the internet to see how our ordinance stacked up. Had there been any changes, any significant changes to the model ethics ordinance that was what we drafted? It was a model ordinance that came down from International Municipal Lawyers Association. Minor adjustments, we tailored it to our needs and pretty much passed it intact. And so, having stepped away from being involved in that area of the law, I went on the internet to try to bring myself up to speed and see if we still have an ordinance that made sense, 30 years later, basically. And what I found was that we did. I thought this particular PowerPoint and paper that he wrote and presented, to the International Municipal Lawyers Association was extremely helpful in kind of condensing, what a good ordinance should look like. Ours has all of those elements. We have what they call a bifurcated one where we have the rules, the strict rules of law and procedure, and then we also have the canons, which are the ethical standards, the aspirational standards. It parallels, the proposed professional code of conduct for lawyers. That's how it was drafted. The rest of the board has heard me say this, but I would just summarize very briefly for Judge Severson. I happen to serve on that International Municipal Lawyers Ethics Committee as the chair, and I worked very carefully for years on that model code when they passed it, and they happened to pass it the year that I was actually chair of that 500-member committee, at an international meeting. And at that time, we were implementing the new form of government, and our charter required an ethics board and ethics ordinance, and it had in there the components, in the charter has the components that should be put in the ordinance. And so we were one of the first cities to actually adopt it because we needed one at that very time, that they were seeing that it was kind of being needed around the country. And so we adopted that particular ordinance. So I also followed up, and I spoke with this gentleman who is the author of this, and he has actually established a practice almost wholly around ethics law and ethics ordinances and ethics procedures because there's a need for it in the country. And he would say that we're ahead of the game in many ways because we already have a board and we already have a code. And he said a lot of cities it's much more difficult after the fact when you have problems with corruption and issues to try to turn things around and then pass ethics ordinance. And he said Texas has had a heck of a time, and they've had a real mess down there, and that's why his practice is thriving. And he's actually, become kind of, he does the speaking circuit nationally. So I spoke for him, spoke with him about it and about our ordinance. And the main thing that I saw that was missing when I went through the paper and I went, and I visited with him, and when I stepped back from it, again, having been here when it was adopted, is the training component. That was just something we were doing administratively, routinely. New council members had a indoctrination session. They learned parliamentary procedure, where I did a section on ethics. We had a training session for them when they first were sworn in. And that has kind of eroded away. And
So when was that in place?
that would have been in '95, when we adopted the ordinance. That time, we also actually trained. We trained both employees and we trained, the city attorney's office. We trained employees and council members routinely.
So what's called for in your proposed ordinance was actually being done?
Yes.
All city employees went through this? All members of city council?
It was separate. We had separate training for city employees that we did for the council. We did it. It was just a pod that we did as part of other, uniform training that we had for employees. And so when we did it, looking back at it, it never seemed like it needed to be an ordinance because it just, like we always did it, you know what I mean? So when I come back and I step back and I go, whoa, what happened to the training? And I started asking my fellow council members, did you receive any training? When I came on, I did not receive any training. I got a copy of the ordinance handed it to me by the city attorney. And she said, you should read this, it's very important. These are ethical rules we have to follow, they're very important, you should read it. And I thought, okay, and that's it, and so it was a concern to me. And then again, when I talked to this gentleman about that, he said, yeah, again, that wasn't in the model code either. But he said that is an issue now, and if you look at his handout, you will see, he puts right in there, one of the most important things is education and conversations are crucial, promote routine training is crucial, and then at the very end, he talks about fostering integrity at City Hall, leadership, administration, regulation, instruction, accountability, transparency. So for me, that was just a glaring no-brainer, a place to start in looking at the ordinance that had fallen away. As I understand it, the previous city attorney did do some training. I don't know exactly when it fell away. It just got less and less until it just kind of disappeared. And so I think it's just one of those things you look back and you go, oh, you know, time changes, things, they don't realize why it's important. The reason it's important is because when you adopt an ethics ordinance, it's more, you're trying to do more than direct people or tell people how to behave. I mean, you know, basically, I've said this before, there's three kinds of ethics. You have your professional ethics, your government ethics, your personal ethics. And, you know, being lawyers, there's three of us in the room, you know, we understand what an ethical code is. We have regular ethics training, you know, as part of our code. Because what you're trying to create is a culture of ethics, is thinking in an ethical way, is getting people to think in an ethical way, for those red flags to go up before they do things. And that's what, you know, creates that integrity and breathes that honesty and integrity and trust into government. Well, without the training component constantly being, you know, done to at least at some periodic period of time, I think what's fallen away is that seeing those red flags go up, that thinking that was there when they were trained routinely. And I can't tell you how often. I mean, I know we did it for all the council members, but I don't know if the employees how often we did it. And it was like, pick a number. You know, I think I have it every 2 years. I mean, we have the council within 6 months after they're, you know, on board. Those are all open for discussion. But I was thinking, you know, 6 months would give them a chance to get, you know, just get the water hose, you know, turned off and just kind of settle in, and then, you know, understanding their role in ethics.
How many city employees do we have?
I think around 1,500. There's different insurance.
As a practical matter, can you get that number of people through training in a 6-month period?
I would see it done, like we recently did a cybersecurity training in pods on the internet. I think there's probably some way it can be done that way, you know, where they have to go through this thing, and I just had to go through it at home and had to pass the test at the end, and then it checked me out. There's various ways to do it. Also, there's times when they meet and they, like for insurance benefits and discussions like that, you know, you could just tie it into those trainings that already exist. But yes, I think that there's, you know, ways that they can do that. And should do that, because what we don't want is the ethics ordinance to be something that you get caught up in, that you get snagged in, that you accidentally, clearly violated, and you know, because you didn't really understand it.
So if you see this as, the curriculum would be obviously under the mayor's, would be determined by the mayor's office, and I assume that would be delegated to Mr. Koister.
I think I put it right in there. It is the city attorney. It's in the proposed ordinance. It's really,
I thought you said the mayor, yeah.
It's the mayor.
okay, the mayor, yes.
Determined, it says here,
You have
in
the
a
city-
form, scope, and manner, that's determined by the mayor.
You have the city attorney under
For
city
council.
council.
Okay,
That might
that's
be
right. We
clear.
put the mayor in charge of it, yes, and it probably will likely, well, it could fall in HR too. HR or the city attorney would likely be involved or decide it. But I was thinking city, because I did put it, the city attorney for the training of the city council. The other thing is, again, our charter requires, you know, what our charter required was, you know, that we deal with financial conflicts, you know, that's your disclosure, your campaign finance laws, the use of the office, that's appearances, you know, not to use the office for personal gain, gifts and honoraria, you know, which is one of just, you know, that we was just discussed. So those were all in there, and the other thing that I noticed, again, that's missing in ours, and it was in 79% of ethics ordinances, was nepotism. Now, we have nepotism as alive and well in the city of Sioux Falls. And so there were 3 other areas that I just am throwing out to you if there's an interest.
But our code is silent on them.
It's silent, and I know why, again, because we had it was working really well, particularly police and fire. There was a lot of firemen whose sons became firemen, and there were policemen whose sons became policemen, and they were really good cops and really good firemen, and that's really the only place that it was happening, and it wasn't causing any problems. It's an area that can cause problems. I don't know that it has in the city capacity, but it might be an area of exploration. For example, I think one of the things you have to be super careful about is that you don't have a father supervising, a direct supervisor of a son, or a wife and a husband, and you have to be careful with supervisory issues when you have a supervisor and they have a relative that's a subordinate. And so there might be some areas we should dabble in, but it's far more prevalent in the city now than it was when I was here. It was just really in police and fire, and now it's kind of all over the place. And to my knowledge, it's not causing any problem. I'm not saying that it is, but there might be some things, some small things that should maybe be tweaked. I think the supervisory one comes to mind a little bit because that can sure cause a problem. The other area that I think, if you're interested in working with me on, I would certainly be a conduit back to the council on, would be the area of rules of procedure for the hearing process. We went through the hearing process, and I think that there's better. I had a set of rules that I actually called this gentleman from, and I gave them to the attorney that was our outside counsel. And he said, "Well, we're just going to follow the ordinance," and I said, "Oh, okay, I guess."
That's the only hearing that's ever been held. Is
Right,
that
and so it might be wise to have, a more polished set of rules. I think we kind of fumbled around a little bit, but if there's no one interested in it, I guess it worked, we got through it. So I saw that was an area that might be helpful, and I know the other area that
Am I reading this
interested
correctly, that your ordinance would mandate it for members of the Board of Ethics, members of the City Council, and employees, but this does not extend to citizen boards and commissions? Is that correct?
I don't think that didn't come up.
So was that your intent, that
It wasn't.
citizen
no.
boards and commissions were not?
That's why I bring it. It's a good reason. That's a good comment. Probably should apply to them as well. We should probably put them either in here. Yeah. That should be discussed. And we should consider whether we want to do that or not. Yeah. I think good suggestion. Did not intentionally leave them out. Just because the rules of ethics do apply to them. The other area that I thought we could tweak just a little bit was, I noticed it again in his handout. Under the sanctions, we have some bare bones sanctions, but this gives, he said, this was suggesting, I think we could add some more sanctions. I think we go immediately to letter of reprimand. And I think that, this talks about a letter of warning, a letter of admonishment, then a letter of reprimand, disciplinary action. I was thinking that might be an area that we could give more flexibility to the board on. That we kind of, ours, the way it is, ours sits right now, it's just pretty aggressive. Doesn't give you a lot of more, I don't want to say, educational, constructive options to work with someone.
You just, Councilman, you just stated authority for sanctions. Who, as I read this board's authority, is
You have sanctions over the employees, the council has sanctions over the council. You don't have authority over the.
I think we recommend, we don't, as I read the ordinance, we make recommendations. We don't impose the sanctions. We're not an adjudicating or a legislative body.
Well, you're an advisory board to the legislative body. You have clear advisory powers. I believe you have disciplinary authority over employees. Final authority over employees. I have to look at it again. I didn't read it before I came today. I should have read the whole ordinance again. But the council, because of the nature of elected officials, were the only ones that had any authority for any kind of sanctions over the elected officials.
I'm just saying, we don't want to inadvertently change the roles of if that's the intent, that should be specific and not done by accident.
I'll reread it, but my recollection is we gave this board some very serious authority because we wanted to get it out of the political realm. Because in the hypothetical world, if you have corruption going on, and the hypothetical leadership is involved in the corruption, then you can't have that person have the final say over, over the end result of that. So I think that was deliberately intended that this board.
Stacy, can you clarify that part?
Again, City Ordinance 35.999 provides that the board would recommend, regarding a city employee, any recommendation they have of a violation would be given to the mayor. If the employee is subject to the authority of the mayor, if it's a council employee, they would provide that to the council. And in the event of if the violation is found by 4 or more members of the board, then they could also recommend reprimand, suspension, administrative fines, or referral to the city attorney for prosecution. So it is at this point, it is a referral.
It's a referral to.
Let's say that is correct, that ours is in the case of employees, we make a recommendation to the administration, correct?
Yeah.
And in the case of members of city council, we find probable cause, and then it goes to a hearing before the other members of the council. Other input or questions of the council?
I would, if you were to prioritize, who should be the priority to get this training out of our 1,500 officials and officers? Can you narrow down who you would do that for? That, it's just like my daughter-in-law says, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. It strikes me that a proposal that we're going to start training 1,500 employees is pretty massive. Could you start with, say, the elected officials, the department heads, the supervisors would be the ones you should start training for, or do you think it's essential at this point to say everybody should get the training?
I think how they do it, if they want to train the supervisors and have the supervisors train their employees, however the administration determines that it wants to do it. But I think, yes, every single employee should have the benefit of this training because every single employee is bound by this ordinance, and is subject to it, and they're right down to the lowest level. How they do it, I think there's a multitude of ways. But again, it's more than just them knowing it so that they don't trip up and fall. It's more about thinking in that ethical way, about thinking, I liken it to, like we have security training. And the idea between the security training is so that when something happens, we just react. We just, know we're supposed to do this, 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 and this. Well, if you have ethical training regularly, when you're faced with a situation, you'll react. It'll come to you, oh, I shouldn't do that, or oh, that's wrong, or I should ask, before I do that. And you start thinking in that ethical way, you act in that ethical way. And it raises government up from the very lowest level and from the very uppermost level down. It's a bottom up, top down thing that you're trying to create when you want to get that culture and ethics in your entire organization. And that's what I mean.
I commend you, Jan, for doing this. And then we do, as a board, it's part of our duty is to recommend legislative changes to effectuate ethics rules, and so this is certainly helpful. I have a couple of reservations, but one is the resources that we required for this, whether, how big of an effort is this, what's it entail? Second, you mentioned lawyers, of course, in South Dakota, we don't have required ethics training. Many do. I'm also
But it's usually offered at most of the bar conventions.
Yeah, and it's not required.
Because we-
In Minnesota, it's required,
A lot of states it's required.
and I'm not sure they're more ethical than us. So I'm not sure, but I'm not saying it's not a good idea, but the effectiveness of it, I suppose, is the question, but I would be a proponent of doing it, assuming the resources required are not prohibited. And then with that, so I support what you're doing. With that, then maybe a couple of language things. I think maybe just get typed up, just as.
Go ahead, pencil it, just
Yeah.
honestly, just scribble on it.
Yeah,
give it to
I
me,
have,
and I'll
yeah.
Do it, and any of you, yeah, any of that.
Okay.
We'll definitely
All right.
talk about the boards and commissions.
Okay, thank you.
Any special handling you have to have for members of the unions? How many union employees do we have in the city? Does that have to be, you have to negotiate that as part of collective bargaining? Is that a requirement?
I don't, I said we have various levels of mandatory training. If we do have to negotiate it, then we should negotiate it. So
I just raised it,
I
I raised it
don't know
as an
whether
issue.
we do or don't, but my problem is I don't see it as a problem because I think it's certainly, I think they would certainly be amenable to it if they know they're subject to it and they could be disciplined and lose their jobs for it. I mean, and why wouldn't they want them to be trained?
I'm assuming
Yeah, I would assume it'd be
I'm
on the
assuming
job
they can resist
training.
it, but it probably has to be handled in a different way than your non-union employees, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there is, in the collective bargaining agreements, there are mandatory training requirements, and this is obviously not currently part of that, so that's something we have to be mindful of. There's a bit of a telling who I represent component to what impact this would have, so there are some unknowns there that can be cured. That being said, with negotiation and that sort of thing, it can be cured, so, really is a dispositive position at this point. It's something as part of the process that would have to be discussed. At this point, I can argue that it's just fine.
That thought certainly crossed my mind when you brought up nepotism. Number one, I'm surprised that the city does not have any rules on nepotism. I know Minnehaha County does, and
Do we, I could be wrong on that. I mean, my brain is foggy just as seriously reminded me of that, so.
And I certainly think that it comes up more frequently in the law enforcement and first responder fields. There's a tradition
Yeah.
of familial participation in that. The county and I'm sure other governments handle that. But that's the one thing I thought, wow, then you'd be really looking at unions and negotiating with the unions. So that might be further down the line. The
I
things
just
you
pointed it
tackle.
out as an area that looked to me, where, when you look where the numbers are and what's contained in ordinances. If you might just want to do that with the nepotism thing, but if you want to, that was very, but I do think, yeah, rules of procedure might be helpful. Maybe again, that's a job for the council, because it was their hearing, and that could be done by just adding that to the ordinance or a policy, for that matter, something more specific, so that we're a little more confident going into that unusual situation. And then, but in the area of sanctions, I do think that would be an area, even if you're in advisory capacity, I would certainly like your opinions. Because I would feel, I wish that there were more options. I wish there were more, again, constructive type options. I like the board, to see the ethics board as something that's feared and respected, but that's working with us as a team to help us have this ethical behavior, this ethical culture. So I don't like them to always just be this heavy hand. And so the idea of a warning letter or a admonishment letter, to me was a good idea as opposed to just immediately going to a reprimand because of different circumstances. And so I think having a panoply of, the longer the better, different choices that you can do so it's more integrated as a relationship, with one that's trying to help and serve the other. It's a two-way street, but that's where I thought, I would be interested in bringing a tweet like that forward. As long as I'm here, and you mentioned what you put in and the council hasn't acted on it, I think that it's just really sensitive for the council right now, and they just, they just are not ready to fight off that whole area, at this point. So I guess bringing this forward, because I do kind of see it as non-controversial, something that just is a cleanup, tightening up, but maybe not a deep dive. But, so
You're saying acting on our recommendations
Right.
from the NYSERD case?
yeah, I don't know that anybody's working on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean anybody isn't, because we don't always communicate that. So.
But your intent is that the ordinance you're going to bring forward is just involving the training at this point?
At this point, yeah.
Well, I commend you for raising this. I don't think this board is going to say that training is not a good idea. More people who start thinking in an ethical way, and you can transform a culture. I think that's a very positive thing. Whether you need to mandate it, I don't know. It's a question. I mean, you said in past administrations it was just done, right? I assume that if the administration, if the mayor's office wants to make sure that all city employees go through ethics training, they can do it. And if they want to extend that to union employees, they can make that part of the collective bargaining. And then city council can decide for itself whether it wants to mandate it for its members.
It could be done, but that, to me, that's the problem. I mean, then you've got that hit and miss. And again, if you're trying to create a culture, maintain that culture, and it is government, and I think right now more than ever, we're looking for these kinds of things that enhance our credibility with the public, that make us,
I'm just saying, I don't know whether it's
Well,
necessary
yeah,
to be
that was
mandated or not.
part of why I consulted with the gentleman down in Texas. And I said, are they putting those in ordinances now? Because I look back and go, man, we should put that in there. It's just, to me, it was a no-brainer. We should have just put that in there, but we didn't think about it because we were just doing it.
If I were tasked with the next 6 months, making sure that every single city employee and every elected city official went through, and every member of every citizen commission and board went through this training in a 6-month period, I'd be a little overwhelmed.
To me, it could be just, as simple as a module where they just have to read an initial, and then with little explanations by it, just something that lets people know what their responsibilities. For example, one of the things that I noticed happening in the employee level is, it strictly, employees have to be careful during election time, and some of the provisions in the ordinance are there to protect them, so that they're not. So that the candidates aren't asking them for money and aren't getting them involved in their elections. And there's this internet activity going on where city employees were engaging, in the campaign process, and it's like, whoa, the red flags were going up for me, but obviously they weren't going up for the employees. But that's addressed, their role in that is addressed, and that's a tripping place for people to be tripped up. And then, get on the wrong side of an elected official before the elected official gets in. That's it.
Your proposed ordinance deals just with training, as I read it, but then are you envisioning a separate code of ethics different than what's in the ordinances now? Well, this is much more comprehensive than there is now, as far as I know. So just a question of whether or not, like a state bar ethics rules, I mean, that's book, and I've had to take tests on that. But it's totally separate, and there's rules, and then there's comments and considerations and opinions. Is that what you're envisioning?
No, that's, at the moment, I think what we have in place is pretty sufficient. I have not heard back from INLA. I've been trying to reach them during COVID. It was really hard to reach them and get some information, on an updated version of the model code and just see, if they're still involved with it and what is out there. But assuming there's no massive changes to what that code is, I don't see any massive changes to ours. It's worked pretty well for us over the years, I think. Just, the fact that we only had, one hearing in all these years. And again, during a period when there wasn't any training.
Further comments or suggestions for Councilor Brady?
So I guess what I'd like from you guys, if you could, I don't know what you want to do, but, give you some time to have, if you want to do it for the work, dig into it a little deeper yourselves, feel free to do that. Again, I come back before you, and with any suggestions that you have, if you want to give me your language ones right now, at the end of the meeting, I'll take them and, if I like them, I'll incorporate it in. If not, I'll tell you why I didn't, and I'll have a new draft, and you can, there's no timeline. This is no urgency, just as time permits.
Well, we appreciate you bringing this matter forward, and look forward.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Mr. Quaster, anything further we address on that? Sir?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Is there any other new business that any member of this board wishes to bring forward?
Nope.
So that concludes it's a full agenda, I believe. Is there a motion to adjourn this meeting? So, second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We stand adjourned.
Well, you can't really presume.
Yes.
Yes.
That's a good one. Thank you.
That's all we're going to have meetings.
I'm smart enough to